My introduction to the Rockpile in early 1968 came at a time when the siege of Khe Sanh was already dominating radio traffic across northern I Corps. And although we were not stationed inside that combat base, the ground between us and it felt connected in a way that maps alone could not explain. By the time I got there, more than 100 Marines had already been lost fighting for control of the ground around it. The summit itself was small, barely large enough for a landing pad and a handful of men. But the valleys below was paid for in American lives, and holding on to it would prove costly as well. The helicopter would circle once before setting us down, easing into a hover over the timber landing pad that had been built across the summit. And when I stepped off, the first thing I noticed was how little room there actually was. People here mountain and assume space, but the top measured roughly 40 feet in length and less than 20 feet at its widest point, and once the aircraft lifted away, you were confined to that narrow slab of wood and rock with steep drops on every side. The Rockpile, officially designated Elliot Combat Base below the summit, sat north of Route 9 and roughly 10 miles south of the demilitarized zone, positioned at the junction of several valleys that had long served as infiltration routes for North Vietnamese forces moving south. From the crest, you could see Route 9 stretching west toward Khe Sanh and east toward Dong Ha, and on a clear day, visibility extended far beyond what seemed reasonable, out toward the South China Sea to the east and toward high ridgelines to the west. That range of vision was the reason the position existed, and it was why it had been identified in July 1966 by Marine reconnaissance teams. Securing the surrounding area had not been simple. During Operation Hastings in the summer of 1966, approximately 8,000 Marines and 3,000 South Vietnamese troops moved into the region to disrupt major enemy formations operating near the demilitarized zone. By early August, U.S. forces reported more than 800 enemy killed and over 200 weapons captured, while Marine casualties numbered 126 killed and more than 400 wounded. After that push, a small observation team landed on the summit and established a permanent presence. From that point forward, the Rockpile remained under American control, typically defended by a small contingent on the crest, and supported by larger units stationed below at Elliot Combat Base. By 1968, the base below felt crowded and improvised rather than permanent. It sat in an open valley near the Cam Lo River, surrounded by elephant grass that grew uncomfortably close to the perimeter wire. Tents, trenches, and low bunkers were placed wherever space allowed. The three largest tents served as kitchen, mess hall, and first aid station, and the mess tent had dirt floors with long planks set waist-high so men could stand and eat without chairs or tables. When it rained, the ground softened into mud that clung to boots and clothing. When it dried out, dust covered everything from rifles to rations. Up on the summit, most of the day was spent behind binoculars, scanning the valleys that converged below and watching Route 9 as it cut across the landscape. If something moved in a way that suggested more than farmers or livestock, you marked the grid and passed it along to artillery units positioned elsewhere. Food came in by helicopter, and it rarely changed. Sea rations rotated through in predictable cycles: canned meat, beans, spaghetti, fruit cocktail, and after enough repetitions, the smell alone identified the contents before the lid was fully open. Water arrived the same way, carried in and rationed carefully, especially when weather grounded aircraft. Pilots often had to abort landings because fog closed in quickly, or crosswinds swept across the summit at speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour. On those days, you waited, knowing that everything from fresh batteries to mail depended on conditions you could not control. Although the Rockpile was often considered safer than prolonged jungle patrols, largely because its steep slopes made a direct assault unlikely, safety was relative. Mortar and artillery rounds would occasionally hit the summit. There was little depth to the position, so when incoming fire crept closer, you learned quickly where to lie flat and how to minimize exposure. Casualties did not arrive in waves, but they occurred often enough to prevent complacency. A man standing upright at the wrong moment or moving across open ground below at the base would often become a casualty without ever seeing the source of the round. The geography that made the Rockpile valuable also made it vulnerable in certain respects. While it dominated the immediate valley, it was overshadowed by higher terrain in nearly every direction. Control of the rock provided a central observation platform astride Route 9. That road shaped much of what we did. Convoys moving along Route 9 were vulnerable to ambush from the surrounding mountains, and enemy forces understood the cover those ridgelines provided. From the Rockpile, observers could monitor likely approach routes and coordinate artillery fire to disrupt enemy concentrations before they struck. Rotations on the summit varied, sometimes lasting several weeks, sometimes longer, and there was an understanding that completing a tour there without serious injury counted as good fortune. Hygiene was limited by water supply, clothing stayed damp during monsoon periods, and boots rarely dried completely. The constant wind across the crest and the confinement of the summit created a strain that was less dramatic than open combat, but persistent in its own way. From 1966 through 1969, the Rockpile remained under American control, not because it was expansive or heavily fortified, but because relinquishing that vantage point would have reopened infiltration routes the High Command had worked to close. Its importance lay in what it could see and what it could report, and that responsibility rested on small groups of men rotating through a position that was at once exposed, confined, and strategically significant. When my rotation ended and the helicopter lifted me off the summit, another group stepped off into the rotor wash to take our place, because regardless of weather, monotony, or incoming fire, someone had to remain on that rock and continue the rest of the war in Northern I Corps.